The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor travel guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello, it's Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide here. Welcome to this month's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. This is just a note to say that if you are hearing this, then you are not currently part of my membership programme and will only be hearing the first part of each show. In order to access full episodes of the Tudor History and Travel Show, you will need to become a member of my membership site, The Ultimate Guide to Exploring Tudor England, via the link in the description associated with this podcast. And today's episode takes us over to Essex on the east of the country, and we will be visiting a very noble castle, Hedingham Castle, home to the De Vere family. Well, I'm going to give you quite an intro as to why, particularly, I wanted to visit Hedingham and do a podcast recording there at the beginning of the on-location recording. But for now, I just want to deal with a couple of points of housekeeping. The first is to say, if you're listening to this in the month that this podcast episode is dropped, which is November 2024, and you're interested in Thomas Cromwell, then I have a real celebration going on. As many of you will already be aware, in just a couple of days' time, the new series of Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light, airs on BBC, and there are many of us who are very excited about that. And to celebrate, I have been pulling together some of my blogs that I've written over the years about Thomas Cromwell's property portfolio into one convenient location on my website, and I am calling it The World of Thomas Cromwell. There's an interactive map that places these locations in their geographic locations, as well as the current write-ups of a number of his property portfolio. And in fact, I'm in the process of continuing to complete that project. Currently, I'm working on The Rolls, which was Cromwell's head office off Chancery Lane in London. Nevertheless, you can tap in and read all the blogs that have been written so far, including a number of other locations which have links, interesting links to Thomas Cromwell. If you are interested, then I suggest you head to my Instagram account and look in my bio, where there will be a link to the World of Thomas Cromwell. Alternatively, I'm sure that if you search on Google for the Tudor Travel Guide and the World of Thomas Cromwell, that page will be popping up. Normally, this part of my website is available only to members of my membership, The Ultimate Guide to Exploring Tudor England, but in celebration of the new series of Wolf Hall, I am going to make it freely available through the month of November. So do make sure you check it out. And of course, if you like what you see and you are not yet subscribed to my blog, please do so. You can do so from the homepage, www.thetudortravelguide.com, and then you'll receive all the updates to my latest projects. And secondly, very quickly, before we go over to Hedingham Castle, I just want to let those of you know that we still have one place available on our forthcoming Anne and Elizabeth, Mother-Daughters, Traitors, Queens tour, which I'm running as co-founder of Simply Tudor Tours in May next year. We also have a couple of other tours booking, including the Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn for September 2025. Just a reminder that if you are interested and contemplating what you might want to do next year with a Tudor flavour, then head over to www.simplytudortours.com and look at our tours to see what is currently available. Castle. We look forward to seeing some of you in person. Okay, that's all I want to say by the way of housekeeping. It is time, as ever now, to go time travelling, and we are going to whiz across to the east of the country, as I said, over to the county of Essex, to visit the little village of Castle Hedingham, where you will find the venerable ancestral home of the De Vere family. As I tell you in a moment, a very important family in relation to the Tudors. And our guide today is in fact the chatelaine of the castle, Demetra Lindsay, who will introduce herself in a moment. Okay, so it's time to buckle up and let's go time travelling.
Well, welcome, dear listeners, to this episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. And I have come all the way over to the east of the country, to the county of Essex, and to a little village called Castle Hedingham. Now, already some of you may be familiar with the ring of those words, because in Castle Hedingham there is a castle called Hedingham Castle. Would you believe it? A little bit confusing, but we are here today to follow up particularly on the story of a couple of Tudor noblemen, one in particular who I came across when I was reading more about the Wars of the Roses. And if you do any reading about the Wars of the Roses, it won't be long before you come across the name of John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford. John de Vere was a stalwart supporter of Henry VII and was absolutely instrumental in ensuring his victory at Bosworth. And when you read anything about him, you'll find out he has an absolutely fascinating life story. In fact, it's incredible that he even made it to Bosworth. But we'll come on to that in a moment, because I have the pleasure today of having the owner of Hedingham Castle here with me to be our guide. So without further ado, let me introduce Demetra. Demetra Lindsay, hello, and thank you for welcoming us to your home.
Hello, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Oh, well, I'm so looking forward to today. I've really been looking forward to coming here and finding out more about De Vere's story, and also finding out more about this beautiful castle. So there's a lot of ground to cover, I am sure, because there are many illustrious members of the De Vere family, and we're probably going to focus on a couple of them. But before we go any further, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and when you first came to Hedingham and what it's like living here.
Well, my husband and I, Jason and myself, have been living here for 20 years. And we were living in London before that. I'm an architect, he's an art dealer. And we knew we were going to come and live here because my father-in-law had decided that was who was going to inherit the castle. He inherited it from his cousin who didn't have any children, who was actually a Magendie. And she wanted to leave the castle to someone who was related to the De Veres. So although the castle had been sold in sort of 1680 to the Ashurst, and the name changed because there were no male heirs, she wanted to ensure that her heir, who was related to her, also was the right person was related to the De Veres, because of course that's a really lovely circle.
Isn't it lovely?
Isn't it? So we're related to the De Veres.
You are one of the descendants of the De Vere family.
Which is rather amazing. And so we have been here 20 years, discovering, exploring, renovating, clearing, all
taking
care of this amazing place, and it's been quite an adventure.
Oh, wow. Well, we're going to find out about some of it. We are currently this is the dining room, isn't it? And a rather splendid room it is too. I should just emphasise before I go any further, if I haven't already said so, dear listeners, there is, as ever, a show notes page associated with this podcast where you'll see images of our adventures today, our adventures in time today. But I did just want to say, before we start talking about the De Veres, you brought us into the dining room. May I just mention this incredible Tudor artefact?
Of course.
That is, of course, related to the De Veres in that it was a gift. Now, can you tell us what we're looking at over the mantelpiece of the fireplace?
So we are looking at a chimney piece, which is about 1.5 meters high and about 1.5 meters wide. It's square, and it's actually the back bit of a 4-poster bed that was given by Edward VI to the Earl of Oxford on his coronation because he was the Lord Chamberlain. And in those days, you were given a present for doing all the organising and presumably paying for it quite a lot.
Yeah.
And there wasn't an awful lot else to give, you know. So actually giving the bed was the thing to do. And this bedhead is amazing because it's beautifully carved, it's gilded, it's in 10 panels, 5 above 5. And the central panel in the top bit has got the initials KE for King Edward and Edward's crest there, and underneath in the second batch of 5 panels, there's the Earl of Oxford has got his crest and the blue boar, and all the rest of it. And it's a stunning bit of Tudor furniture.
I think it's amazing, and I really wanted to highlight it.
Absolutely.
There will be a picture of this, therefore, in the show notes page. I wanted to really highlight it because, as we were talking about before we started recording, I think the number of artefacts associated with Edward because of his short reign and because he was so young is quite few and far between.
I'm sure.
And so it's a real treat to see that.
What's amazing about it as well is that the keep used to be in the keep, and the keep burnt in 1918. But before that, they made this room that we're in at the moment from a smoking room and adjacent butler's pantry. They knocked the two together and made this rather lovely dining room. And then they needed the chimney piece, so they went to the keep and sort of salvaged it from there.
And saved it.
Aren't we lucky? And thus saved it.
That is incredible. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. What can you tell us about the roots of the De Vere family and maybe how they became the Earls of Oxford?
Well, I have here a scroll to show you.
Let's have a look.
Because it is an incredible bit of history, this. This is actually a scroll commissioned by the 17th Earl of Oxford, who was very proud. And he wanted to show everybody his lineage. And the fact that the Earls of Oxford, well, before they became Earls of Oxford, came over with William the Conqueror. So Alberic de Vere was one of William the Conqueror's BFs. You wouldn't be able to pick up that, would you? And then you can just use a weight at the other end, because otherwise it'll roll itself back up again. So this scroll is incredibly long.
Look at this.
And it's very precious. It's been backed, thankfully, by somebody a while ago so that we can unroll it.
So can I ask, what does this date to, this scroll?
So we think, the 17th Earl of Oxford was born in 1550. So I think he was getting very proud maybe when he was 25 years old.
So we're talking about a genuine 16th century document.
Genuine 16th century thing.
Look at this.
And isn't this amazing? And if we look carefully, we will find William the Conqueror, and it always takes me a while to find him. So we have to look back to see all these kings on it everywhere.
Yes.
And so around here somewhere is William the Conqueror. But I haven't got my glasses on.
No, I can't see them, but
it's really difficult, but he's here somewhere.
Yeah.
And then as you go through, you get these are all the earls as they come along, and this scroll is very long. In fact, I don't know whether we're going to get...
We are unrolling it, dear listeners, on the grand dining table, and so far it's...
There we are.
Oh, there you go. So
there we go.
It's a good sort of 7 foot long, something
I'd say
like
it's
that.
7 foot long.
7 foot long, something like that, yeah. And again, there'll be a picture of this, but we've just got all the heraldry, and in tiny, neat writing, we've got all the names
of the names. It is rather amazing. So... Alberic de Vere came over in 1066 with the Duke of Normandy, William, known as the Conqueror, as we all know. And he had a half-sister called Matilda. And Alberic de Vere was allowed to marry Matilda.
I see.
So they were very good friends. And William the Conqueror gave Alberic lots of lands, and he was sensible enough to give him lands over in what we now know as Oxfordshire, as well as London, what we now know as London, but, in those days, little villages called Kensington and, completely insignificant places in those days became incredibly valuable later on. But, people ask why he was called, why his grandson was then made the Earl of Oxford by Empress Matilda. And that was because I think that's where one of his lands were that he preferred, and that was sort of...
And it is always confusing, I think, for people. Again,
even though his seat was then in Essex.
So he obviously at some point decided this was where he preferred to reside.
And also I think that whole wool trade thing and, the money was in East Anglia. It was incredibly rich.
Of course.
And so actually, to put one's seat where the real value was, I think was very sensible.
And so Hedingham Castle, the foundations of it, it's well known today, isn't it, for having the finest Norman keep, and wow, what a keep.
It is an extraordinary place. I mean, we're so lucky to have it still not bashed up and able to be walked around.
Indeed, and we're going to go over and we're going to explore it, so you'll get a sense and a feel of us as we go around, dear listeners. But when was this particular castle first founded, do we know?
We know that it was finished roughly, well, we call it 1133 because it's a nice number, but it was definitely started in sort of 1122, they think, because the difference in chevron moulding and in that sort of that look varies very subtly over that period.
I see.
Those 20 years, you couldn't tell. The masons moved around and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So they had very different styles, and actually the influence of the Crusades is really big on the decoration of Norman sculpture, as they call it. So as it progresses, it very slightly subtly changes, but there are early styles there too.
And is that because they're influenced by what they see during the travels in the Crusade, and they bring those influences
so
back
we have chevron mouldings, we also have dogtooth things, and they're subtly different, and it depends whether people have been influenced by the East or not.
Oh, that's interesting.
I know, it's really good, isn't it? I love it. And they're also Roman tiles fitted into bits of the keep as well. So they were definitely using sort of the land around, and of course there's no stone in Essex, so it's faced in Barnack stone, which is a quarry near Stamford, and so quite a long way north of here, nearly 100 miles.
Yeah,
and so all that stone had to come down through the river system. And all, which was much better in those days because, of course, the roads were so appalling. So it was such a work.
Yes, a great undertaking.
A great
undertaking. And I'd love to hear about how the castle developed, and particularly what it was looking like during the Tudor period. But I think we'll go outside to do that. Yes. But to introduce us to that, let's fast forward through the generations, because, as I mentioned, my particular area of interest is John de Vere the 13th.
Of course.
Who we've casually nicknamed Bosworth Boy.
Which is, I think you'd be very proud about that, actually. I mean, it's better being called the Wedge, but it's much better that he's called Bosworth Boy.
Yes, So here we have John de Vere. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about his story leading up to Bosworth, because it really is fascinating. Suffice to say, he was born in 1442, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And he had a very sad early bit, didn't he? Because his father didn't manage the skiddle to one side of court to the other when, the Henry VI,
yes,
and Edward IV, were all busy warring and everything, and he got his head chopped off. But before that, his brother was also executed.
Yes,
6 days before in the Tower. I mean, what his father must have felt having watched his son die and then had 6 days to think about it before he was then also executed must have been horrendous. And John, sitting at home, with that tragedy going on in his life, he must have been really angry because you then think about how that portrayed the rest of his, until Bosworth, he was warring all the time.
I should say at the time that his father and brother were executed, he was 19. He was also, so he was the second son.
He was.
He wasn't meant to inherit, was he?
No, he hadn't been schooled in that sort of way, like Henry VIII hadn't either.
No, so suddenly he finds himself now heir to the titles. Yes. And I think what I find really interesting, and we'll see this, I think, as we just explore this story a little bit more, Edward kind of just gave him all the titles back, because normally, of course, a family would lose all their titles through the Act of Attainder, and but he didn't. He got all his titles and land, and
which is astonishing, isn't it? Because I also think one wonders why. But I think the respect of the people on whose lands, who lived on the lands, goes a long way, don't they? They all need somebody to look up to, and actually, Edward needs people, otherwise there's that sort of barrenness. I mean, of course, they get given to everybody else. And, when he comes back skipping forward from his trip abroad, we'll come back to that. He gets given a whole lot back, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Of people, other people's. But yes, so he is given back a lot of wealth again, but uses it then against Edward, eventually, which is interesting. But Edward was obviously trying to keep his enemies closer. He was
obviously in a very conciliatory mood at that point.
Yes.
I mean, first big mistake, really. He wasn't to know that, but it was it was a big mistake.
Yes.
So then you have John de Vere, if I recall the story. He kind of schmoozes a bit with the House of York. He gets given a position.
Yes.
I think High Chancellor of England, and he becomes Chamberlain to the Queen's household. He officiates or is part of Elizabeth Woodville's coronation. So everything's going
very
swimmingly.
Very much part of that coronation. Definitely.
So he kind of plays the game for a while.
I think he got given a bed for that too.
Did he?
Yes, absolutely. I think even possibly 2 beds for that one. Yes.
So he's playing the game of being on the Yorkist side. But then we get to that point where, we're fast forwarding, I think, a little bit. We get to the point where Warwick, the Kingmaker, and he's, of course, married, isn't he? He's married to the sister of Richard Neville.
Yes.
So there's a connection there. And then, of course, Richard Neville falls out big time with Edward IV, and as does Edward's brother, the George, Duke of Clarence. And at that point, he switches. He shows his true colours.
Yes.
What happens then?
Over.
Yeah, the pretense is over. Can you tell us what happens next?
Gosh, what happens next? I mean, he joins the Margaret, doesn't he? The former Queen Margaret. And Henry VI by this time is always depicted as rather, I mean, he must have lost his marbles a bit or whatever. Anyway, Margaret really takes over, doesn't she?
She does.
And ends up at St Michael's Mount, which is rather amazing bit of the story. And they besiege, Edward's forces besiege St Michael's Mount, and he's sort of captured there for a bit, nearly a year or something amazing. Is it 10 months?
He holds out there. I think, and I think also, if I remember rightly, he, as you said, he goes to join Margaret, and then they manage to eventually to launch an invasion of England. They get Henry VI back on the throne for a period of time.
But it pivots in
flip-flops.
Yes, it depends. If you miss a year out of the history, then you'd be like, oh, it's still Edward. But actually, it wasn't 10 months. But I mean, it was so flip-flop, wasn't it, at that point?
Yeah,
yes.
And of course, that all then goes horribly wrong.
Yes.
Edward's back. I think, if I remember rightly, John de Vere has to flee again. And then eventually, you're right, they try and land, don't they? They try and
land in Essex at St Osyth, and the Earl of Essex, really confusingly, is the one that pushes him away. And then they try and land in Norfolk. And I think they end up in York somewhere, don't they? Up in Yorkshire.
I can't.
And join Margaret's forces again. But I think they get to London and that goes horribly wrong. And eventually he gets captured.
Yes.
And he gets put in a castle called...
Yes, Hams.
Yes.
Near Calais.
Which is near Calais. And he's there for 12 years, which is an awfully long time considering people don't live that long, isn't it? I mean, it's extraordinary. And he's obviously still young enough and angry enough to live, and he really wants, and he's constantly writing letters, I think, and he's keeping the cause going. And his wife, Hedingham Castle falls into complete ruin, and his wife is living in penury, and you know, it's a pretty sad, sorry state. So anyway, yes, he's sitting in the castle at Hams, and he escapes.
But first of all, doesn't he try and throw himself from the battlements? And nobody knows whether he's trying to escape or kill himself.
Exactly. And I cannot believe he was trying to kill himself. I just don't think that's the character profile at all. Do you? I
don't. I think to have survived so much.
Yes. And seen so many of his, you know, the Duke of Clarence or whoever, all being killed in the field around him, just to sit and give up at that point, I don't think there's any real basis for that. And yet there is this myth that he ends up in the moat. For whatever reason. Anyway, he survives.
And then they put him back in the castle.
And they put him back in the castle, but then he gets out again.
And he does so by schmoozing his jailer. Yes. I think it was James Blount, I think he schmoozed, who then defected with him.
Yes, which is an amazing thing. So he'd obviously waffled on enough about the causes and all the rest of it. And yes, and got Blount to basically probably release him and join with
Henry Tudor.
How strong, yeah. He joins the Jasper, the Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Tudor for their bid for the sovereignty, and off they go to Bosworth.
Yeah,
and thus he becomes the Bosworth boy.
Because he is the man who leads Henry Tudor's vanguard.
Yes,
and
absolutely, and make sure that in the shape of his forces that that Edward's troops have to go into the marshes. So they were really outnumbered, weren't they, at Bosworth?
They were indeed. The Lancastrians were outnumbered.
Yeah, seriously outnumbered. But because of this tactic, they won the day.
Yeah. And I should just say, dear listeners, if you do want to know about Bosworth, a very recent podcast that goes into a lot of detail about the battle itself and about the military tactics that were used by both sides, both by John de Vere and also by John Howard on the other side, the opposing side. So if you're interested in that, please do go and tune in. So yes, that's why we've nicknamed John de Vere Bosworth Boy. He was the hero of the hour. Now, this morning, when I came and knocked on your front door, one of the first things that you showed me was another artefact, which is a direct commemoration of that event. Can you show and talk to me about what you were discussing? So there's a stone relief, I guess you would call it.
It's a stone relief, and it was... So, you know, as records of historical moments go, this is actually really extraordinary because it is stone. It must have cost an awful lot of money. What it shows is the Battle of Bosworth, and in the centre is the king, now Henry VII, on his horse, in a wonderful gold tunic, and underneath his rearing horse is poor old Richard III,
It's crushed.
who is crushed
with his crown
with
on
his
the ground.
crown looking a bit pathetic. And just tucked behind him, also on his horse, is the Earl of Oxford with his shield, very proudly displayed. And this was actually not commissioned by the 13th Earl. This was commissioned, we think, by the 16th Earl, who had an interesting time because he wasn't a very illustrious Earl particularly, but he was obviously carrying favour with the royals, well, with Henry VIII
right.
at that point. Anyway, but it's just a wonderful memory of that battle.
So again, this is a 16th century artefact.
It is. And it used to be here. It was then sold through, when the Buckinghams got involved, and I think that was by marriage at some point, it drifted away from the castle. It was in a house near here. It then ended up at Stowe, where it still is, even though we keep asking for it back. Weirdly, they don't want to give it us back. But anyway, it's now been very much put in pride of place by Sir John Soane, the famous architect, outside the Gothic Library at Stowe.
Can you see it? Is it possible
you
to
can go and
see
see it? You have to ask. It's outside the headmaster's study.
Right. So we should say Stowe is now a school,
yes,
but it
is.
was once obviously a grand private residence.
But very, very grand private residence of the Dukes of Buckingham. And it's enormous and rather an amazing place to go to, actually. If you want to visit somewhere, it's staggering. The gardens are amazing, but the building is also amazing. And it has this incredibly rich history.
That's so interesting. It's now down on my to-see list.
It is good.
I didn't know about it, but what a fantastic remnant. And I was also just saying, it's mindful. It reminds me, dear listeners, of the Cowdray murals and how the owner of Cowdray at the time was trying to show his position at the court of King Edward in association with some of the grand events associated with those sort of late 1540s, 1550s, like the coronation of Edward VI. But this is instead, rather than being a mural, this is actually moulded or carved in stone.
Carved in stone.
Very beautiful indeed.
It is, and I actually do go, because when you see it for real, because it's 3D and it's a relief, it is remarkable. Yeah. So,
needless to say, Henry Tudor, the new King Henry VII, is rather grateful to his Earl of Oxford, and he becomes one of the most important men, I think, at the court for Henry VII.
Yes, absolutely. He also gives him, so he becomes the Lord Chamberlain, doesn't he? Again, sort of thing. Well,
it was a hereditary Lord High Chamberlain, I think. Yes.
But he's also given the lands of Castle Rising. He's given Framlingham, nicked from the Duke of Norfolk,
who is now dead at Bosworth.
Yes, exactly. And so his fortune is restored, and thus they start a big refurb programme of Hedingham.
So Hedingham becomes his base. That's where he returns to. Has his wife been here during this time? What happened to Hedingham?
Do you know, it's interesting. I don't know where she was living, actually, but Hedingham had disintegrated. It was a Norman fortress. It had Norman walls. When nobody's living here, he was away at least for 12 years and then off and on during all the fighting that happened before that. So he wasn't really concentrating on that, even though, of course, his chatelaine would have been. But when there was no money and everything had been stripped from him, she would have probably, been the one who was sitting by the hearth in one room of this enormous place, doing her sewing and living off that. So they then restored it. Amazingly, the keep was in really good nick, but all the buildings around it had probably just disintegrated. They would have been much smaller, less well-built affairs. So they rebuilt. Instead of the old barbican, which was stone and flint, they built a beautiful Hampton Court-esque in style gatehouse. And instead of the drawbridge, they then built the four-arched Tudor bridge, which we still have today.
Do you know what? I think this would be a brilliant time to just take a little walk and go and have a look at some of those. And maybe we can talk about the castle as it was redeveloped and where it got to under the 13th Earl
Yes.
with all his wealth and status and money, and what it would have looked like, because Henry visited here, didn't he? Henry VII
He
came?
did, 1498.
Okay.
That's another story, gosh.
Okay.
It was a huge honour, of course, to have the king to stay, but you didn't just have the king to stay, you had his whole entourage. So you had to be able to afford to feed probably 300 people, which is quite extraordinary. Particularly when you all know that Henry VII was really miserly and, lived heartily off his subjects, generosity. But when he left, having had this great, endless banquets and whatever, mind blank. The 13th Earl, John, thank you.
Do you want to say that again,
yes.
when he left?
So when he left, John, a little too proudly, lined the drive and his way home with all his people. And when I say people, it was, were they his retinue? Were they his army? And of course, in those days, it was totally illegal for obvious reasons to have a private army. And Henry VII looked at his really good friend John and said, you're overstepping the mark here, mate. You're showing me honour by lining the road and all the rest of it, but actually what you're really doing is slightly beating your chest. Anyway, whatever. He was fined 15,000 marks.
Ooh.
Which is millions. I mean,
wow.
Yeah, and we wonder, so this is very definitely post the build. So, he'd done all the expensive bits, but we wonder whether this was the beginning of the decline of the Earls of Oxford because they spent so much money, on this fine. But I mean, that's how because the kings were always the poorest people in the country, weren't they? Because they didn't really have their own money. They had to get the taxes and spend it all on wars. And
that's true. I was just doing a lot on Henry VII, and he was always going off to his wool merchants in the Cotswolds in particular and asking for loans for this, that and the other. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, that was a bit of a social faux pas, wasn't it?
I mean, how stupid. I mean, it's, having played the game so nimbly all his life, to then fall at the last hurdle is extraordinary, isn't it?
Indeed it is. Anyway, with that, we'll continue our storytelling, but let's go outside because it's such a beautiful day here. It's
lucky.
a September day, but the sun is out, the sky is blue, and it'd be lovely just to go and get a little bit of a view of what's here at the castle. Brilliant.
such a
Lead the way.
Thank you. Right, actually that's a gorgeous day, amazing.
That's lovely.
Thank you.
So we've come outside, as people can hear, I'm sure, crunching our way across the gravel towards this glorious, beautiful red brick bridge with these wonderful pointed arches. And maybe this, therefore, is a time to pause and just orientate ourselves in time and space. Yes. I.e., can you talk about the layout of the castle in its broadest sense and where we are now and where we're walking towards?
Absolutely, and I think that would really help. If you can imagine, there are 2 baileys, and it's called a figure of 8 configuration. So we are on the we're on the outer bailey right now, and the bailey, of course, is the flat bit of land at the top of the motte, and we are crossing the dry moat to the inner bailey. And the bridge is the bit that connects the two. And before the Tudor bridge, there was the Norman bridge, which was actually a drawbridge. And you went across the drawbridge through the Barbican, which is like the gate tower, but of course it was really defensive, and that was where the murder holes were, and the portcullis, the first portcullis, I might add, and all of that, and so that there were walls, so that as you walked through, should someone want to kill you, that was really easy at that point. But the Tudors then took that down. They also took away the Norman walls, which were made of flint, and they replaced them, possibly more in a picturesque sense, with brick walls, because of course brick wall was more fashionable, but also much less defensive. And in the centrepiece of that was a gate tower that had very similar feel and look to it, style-wise, as Hampton Court. With those sort of 2 towers with a sort of clock in the middle, and don't know whether there was a clock, but that sort of look. And behind that was the keep. So in fact, it would have masked the keep as you went over.
It would have, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah,
whereas
absolutely.
now we see the keep as the sort of centre of the focus.
It's all its glory.
In all its glory.
Do we have any idea what the size of the outer and inner bailies were together? Just the scale.
The inner bailey is 4 acres, and the outer bailey is about 3.
Okay, so 7 acres.
7 acres, it's a big area. And the outer bailey was used as Norman times as the farm. And in fact, in the Tudor times, there was a Tudor, sort of possibly manor house here, which if you're now looking at our website or whatever for further pictures, that's the smaller bit of the house, the Georgian house, that was reclothed in Georgian times to make it look like the wing of the new house.
Yeah. So, of course, things have changed a lot. It looks very different now, as you're pointing out. The outer bailey is where your home is, essentially.
Yes.
But it would have been the service courtyard.
Absolutely.
At one stage. And we're going to head across the bridge now, because we're heading into the high status side.
Absolutely, and of course, as with any castle, the further in you got, the more high status you were.
Indeed.
But as we cross the bridge, I just want to show you 2 wonderful things. On our left are the archery butts, and there is a diagram which was sort of 1580 sort of thing, and on it is written butts. And here they are. You can see how that would have worked, because you could have fired your arrow from over there across the dry moat, and it wouldn't have gone any further because there was a wall of mound behind you.
Oh, that's very
practical. Very safe, very practical. And on our right, we have what was the real tennis court. And what's rather amazing is that we know that Henry the 7th and 8th, and Arthur, who was Henry the 8th's brother who died, who was the godson of John 13th, played here. Well, they would have done. I mean, we don't know it for sure, but they would have done, because that's what they did.
So this is a grand red brick building with all the kind of hallmarks.
Oh, hang on, no, but that's the Georgian bit. That was built on top of the...
so on top of where?
Yes, so the real tennis court was here, and actually that wall there is an old wall, so that would have been part of the tennis court. thing. And then the Georgians went and put essentially the stables on top of it, the rest of it. But rather curiously, this bridge garden is 27 feet wide, and a real tennis court is 27 feet wide. So actually, how that works, I'm not sure, but there probably would have been the bit where you would have sat and watched over underneath the stables. But it's rather fun, isn't it?
It's wonderful. And you know this because there is a rather lovely 16th century drawing plan. It's a little bit two-dimensional, but it gives you. But in fact, you were saying it's very accurate.
It is ridiculously accurate, and also the Israel Armis survey that was done by Lord Burleigh is incredibly diagrammatic, but ridiculously accurate. I mean, they obviously had to draw something, so they were drawing it correctly.
Yeah, so that's how you know what was here.
So lucky to have these documents.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're heading towards what would have been the gatehouse tower, grand towering gatehouse tower.
Yeah.
With the Barbican, and the Barbican on the inside, you were telling me.
Yes, so that's really unusual because obviously if you have a Barbican that sticks out from the wall, that's much more defensive because people aren't then within the wall by the time you're worrying about them. If you see what I mean.
Indeed.
But because of the way the motte it was sculpted, that was the only option at this point.
So we're literally inside now. We've got this towering tower, which is how many? 5 stories?
Yes, it's 100 foot high.
Wow. With the beautiful Normanesque type arches. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the architecture of it, if there's anything particular. Because I noticed we've got the round arches and we've got the...
Yes, so of course the Norman arch is a round arch, isn't it? It's a semicircular arch. And the mouldings, the sculpture as they call it, are they're the dog-toothed variety, and then there's the chevron, and we have the sort of chevron look. And that's, the third Earl was a Crusader Earl, and he would have had lots of influences with all the Crusades and stuff. But that's the sort of look of it, if you see what I mean.
It's quite magnificent to stand at the foot of it and just
come over here, and then you can see up towards the where the steps are, which would have gone into the former guard room.
They would have been the original steps into the main entrance.
I mean,
to the tower.
actually, to be very accurate, when it was built, there would have been a wooden staircase coming perpendicular from the front door out into the courtyard. And we were looking at the one of the plans earlier. So that there was a big courtyard over here. Where we're standing is actually where the chapel was, and the chapel opened up into a cloister, which is roughly here. And from that cloister, you could have got to the big banqueting hall, which John built sort of. I think if you've been to Hatfield House, there's an Elizabethan banqueting hall there. It might have looked very similar to that, and it'd been a big, lovely timber-framed roof and very grand. By that stage, they would have definitely eaten over here, and the keep was rather used as a sort of, I mean, even then, almost folly in the garden.
I was going to say, was it more like a store? By then, it was outdated.
I think they used it as a courtroom, and they used it to house the garrison. But yes, it was really outdated because, of course, they were beginning to be a bit more interested in food, keeping it warm and all those things. And also, they weren't living in the keep any longer. They lived in the Prospect Tower, which is called the Great Tower as well. And that was on the edge of the Bailey. And rather amazingly, during COVID, when we had the opportunity to take down some of the self-seeded trees around the Bailey that were just busy falling down and all the rest of it, so we had a really good session thinging them out and, making them safe and everything. And we refound the foundations.
That's incredible.
Obviously,
how wonderful.
It's absolutely incredible because it shows the meticulous work that went on to create this beautiful tower and how big it is.
So let's just take a moment to describe. We've come to the very edge of what is currently the lawned area.
Yes, the bailey.
That was part of the inner
Yes.
bailey.
Yes.
And we're looking downwards. We're looking down into the dry muck, but you can clearly see some foundations have been uncovered. There are some sort of they look like octagonal towers.
They are octagonal
Did they
towers.
have
Yes.
spiral staircases
We
in them?
believe so, yes, absolutely. Or possibly we're just little rooms off the big rooms. There's a house relatively close to here called Oxburgh Hall, which has a very similar tower in it.
And I should just say again, I will just highlight for those people listening, dear listeners, this is where looking at the show notes page, because I will be putting some images of basically the 16th century plan of the castle that we've been talking about, and also there's a lovely illustration, isn't there, of the Prospect Tower.
Yes, there is. That's a great thing to look at, actually, because you really get the image of how it was. Yes.
So this was the principal living quarters for the Earl and Countess of Oxford, and any honoured guests?
Absolutely. So Henry VII would definitely have stayed here.
It's lovely.
I love that.
I love
too.
that kind of thing.
And also Henry VIII. Why not? Because when he came, he would have stayed here.
He did come to Hedingham as well, didn't he?
Did, yes, and Elizabeth I. And just see if that's open. If you want, I will join you. If you want to go in the right way, then I'll join you up there to say. Hello. Welcome to the Keep.
Wow, and wow. I mean, this is an incredible space, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Oh, it feels. I mean, this is stating the obvious, but it just feels so beautifully old. And that fireplace.
Well, you're now in the garrison floor, so this is as far as most people would have got in the old days.
Yeah.
And yes, you will start seeing some remarkable Norman features, actually, and the fireplace is one of them. And rather hilariously, the fireplace is really bad. For the fact that this building is still standing 900 years later,
yes.
It is so well built. It is completely plumb. All the rest of it, it has 12-foot walls. Everything about it is extraordinary, and yet what they didn't get right was the drawer of a fireplace. They didn't do chimneys. So the chimney is actually two slots, which are basically 5 centimetres by about 30 centimetres, two of those, and they're literally just behind the fire, up about 3 metres, but nothing to make it draw. So the whole place would have been filled with smoke, probably really quite unpleasant to be in. But, by the time John came along and wanting to build his lovely tower, of course, they'd worked out how chimneys should be, and of course, it would have been a much nicer place to actually live.
Of course.
And, when you think about that sort of comparison, that sort of makes you realise why you would have sort of sidelined this extraordinary building for a new bit of technology.
No, completely. It really does make sense. But still a very useful and practical building to have on site for your garrison or your stores.
Totally, all of that.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, possibly in the back of your mind you're thinking, maybe one day this will be a defensive building again, because they were built. We had a long discussion with the architectural historians about this. Castles from whenever were built for status, but in the defensive style, even in 1133.
Right.
And they were built to show off and to dominate, but definitely to retreat to in the times of, you know, trouble.
Yeah, no, it would have been very comforting to have this in the backyard, to know that, because it was still a very turbulent time.
Absolutely. And
until you get into the 16th century when things really start to quieten down a little bit.
Absolutely, yes.
So, look at those big, I mean, the beams are enormous. And
well, so unfortunately, yes, they are. And they all would have been that big too, because of course it had a structural purpose.
Yeah.
These are actually beams that date from 1924, because in 1918 the keep burnt when they were using it as a lookout tower at the end of the First World War for Zeppelins. And somebody unfortunately knocked over their brazier, keeping themselves warm. And by the time they'd realised what was happening, couldn't put the fire out themselves, gone down to the village, woken up the fireman. The fireman had found his horse, hooked that up to the cart and came up with his tiny weeny bowser of water for a 100-foot high building. The whole thing burnt. So actually, it's a really good thing in a way, because although it was very sad because a lot of records and furniture got burnt, in fact, all the timbers are essentially newish, you know, and so we are able to go all the way up in this building now.
Well, that's a great invitation.
Should we go and see the banqueting hall?
Please, let's go up.
It's wonderful.
Now, this building today has a very useful purpose. Can you tell us how you use it?
Well, yes, so it's funny how things go in circles, isn't it? It's now used as a wedding venue, and it's used for events like jousting and all that sort of thing, because, you know, well, to be frank, you know, the keep has to earn its keep. You know, I'm just opening the door of the banqueting hall here.
My goodness me, we've been going up. I mean, it's a very wide.
It's an astonishingly wide spiral staircase, really unusually wide. And actually, do you see the bricks you're standing on?
Indeed.
In Norman times, it was a stone spiral staircase, and by 300 years had gone by, and to 1485, they were already so worn that the Tudors decided to cut in these bricks, which were essentially just sort of mending it.
Aren't they lovely?
So these are wonderful Tudor bricks.
They're lovely, narrow Tudor.
Aren't they gorgeous?
Aren't they?
Yes, and such a beautiful colour. So it's one of the oldest spiral staircases in the country, which is rather incredible.
Oldest and widest. I mean,
yes.
Normally you're cramped and sort of struggling to get down
and then
the
really
steps.
not enjoying the journey down. Whereas these are absolutely fine. And this is the banqueting hall, and this is an astonishing double height space surrounded by arches on 2 levels.
Oh, I'm in love.
Completely dominated by this extraordinary arch, which is the widest Norman arch in domestic architecture in Western Europe. And I love saying that sentence because it's quite a mouthful, but also it's really fabulous, isn't it? And it's so incredible that this building has got such an extraordinary architectural feature.
It's so welcoming, it's so warm. I'm sure it's not in winter.
Well, funnily enough, we have skipping ahead a few centuries, we now have a wood chip boiler, and so it is warm because today's brides prefer warmth. It actually, when we got here, it used to be the coldest place in the world, and you could come here and your bones would start freezing, even though your mouth would still be moving. It was rather amazing.
It's absolutely beautiful. I mean, I'm just stood here in awe, and please do check out the pictures associated with this. And even better than that, folks, come and visit and stand here for yourself, because that arch is phenomenal. And then you've got all these beautiful little mini arches with the sawtooth carving.
Yes.
Absolutely exquisite. So this would have been the main banqueting chamber.
Absolutely.
During the...
Absolutely.
When it was used.
When it was used. And I think the Tudors probably still used it, to show off in and things. But this is the room that was also used as the courtroom.
Ah.
And I think, you think Corbusier invented open plan living. Actually, the Normans did it much better. Yes. And they have all these alcoves within the thickness of these 12-foot thick walls where they stored bits of furniture and things that they got out for whatever purpose they needed.
Yeah.
Which is rather incredible. And the Earl always sat in this chair over here.
Right.
So people sort of were coming up the stairs. They'd be slightly on the back foot because they were out of breath a little bit. He would be completely settled. Mm. They would get to this point and he would then receive them. And what's wonderful about Norman architecture is that there's so many devices that you don't really appreciate when you're not in the right place. So if you were then being received by the Earl here, if you got a little bit too close and he was a bit worried, you would get to 3 paces forward, you'd get to here, and out of this little specially designed alcove here, his henchman would suddenly appear. But if you were 3 paces back, you would have no idea that alcove even existed.
Yeah.
So it's rather an amazing thing that, he had this sort of very subtle way of protecting himself.
So do we think the likes of the 13th Earl would have been up here receiving
Absolutely.
People and
Absolutely.
dealing with business on the estate?
Totally. And of course, when he was rebuilding Hedingham, this would have been where he lived until it was all done. It would have taken a few years to get it all organised.
How wonderful.
So he definitely would have been here, which is a wonderful thing, isn't it?
It's a great thing, it is indeed. Is there another floor?
There is another floor.
I'm like a little girl at Christmas time.
Well, and it's also amazing to walk around the Minstrels Gallery because you are within the thickness of the walls. We'll go up there.
Minstrels Gallery.
Yes.
We love a good Minstrels Gallery. This door is enormous.
So the reason why we've got doors, these are really new, these doors, even though they look fantastically old. They were made out of Southend Pier, rather amazingly. But that's one of the gorgeous things about upcycling and all the rest of it. Southend Pier were renewing their timbers because they had become rotten where the coach bolts were keeping them on the structure of the pier. So they were taking them up. And hilariously, name drop, but Jamie Oliver was here doing some filming. And he said, and we used to have the little, where I was opening the front door, that platform used to be really small and very wobbly and very rotten. And he was wobbling around on it and he said, well, you need to get yourself down to the pier because they're picking all the timbers up. And they were chopping up all the timbers for firewood. Anyway, you've never seen Jason move faster in his life. He's down there in a flash, making friends with the guys who thought that the story of using the timber from the pier was so fabulous because it was then being used for something else in Essex where it would last forever.
Yeah.
So actually, and it's got this incredible patina, hasn't it? So of course, when you then have to make a door, because what I'm just about to show you in a minute is our new royal chamber, where you can sleep here. You needed smoke doors on all the things, but there are big evidence that there were doors on all the arches anyway, but they weren't replaced after the fire.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So actually, we're putting back something that.
It was there.
Yes,
it was
absolutely.
A feature.
And Historic England, who look at everything that we do,
of course,
we're very happy for us to do that. That was the thing. So we're now going to go into the Minstrels Gallery, and the lovely thing about being up here is how you can look down into the banqueting hall. And the other lovely thing is that you can imagine all the conversations that happened up here.
Oh, yes.
That nobody could lip read you.
Yeah.
Because, of course, everything was so open plan. that you everyone knew everybody's business the whole time. But up here, you're in the thickness of the walls. It's very different scale.
It is. It's lovely. It's very private, very hush, because people probably can hear the acoustics changing as we're moving through. So this minstrel's gallery overlooks the banqueting chamber, but it's, as you said, it's built into the thickness of the walls.
Yeah.
So it's a lovely arch over my head.
And another feature that you will see is quite a lot of graffiti. And actually, when we were having some work done with builders' lights, you know how strong they are?
Yes.
We saw for the first time Cornelius Harrington. Can you see that?
Oh, yes, I can.
And Martin Harrington was born in the lodge. He's my age, and he still works here. And this is his ancestor.
That's brilliant.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And his name is on some of the maps.
Oh,
Harrington.
how wonderful.
So I mean, there is older Castle Hedingham families, the De Veres are probably. Which is just so fabulous. I absolutely love that. And you also start seeing masons' marks. So each of the pieces of stone were marked by a mason in their own style, so that they got paid for it.
Yeah.
I can't obviously see one exactly where I'm standing, but we will come across one. Here's one up there. You see the little red spot.
Wasn't it, feasting and dancing?
Absolutely.
So you've got to create the space that's, amenable to it.
Yeah.
You get a great view of the arch from up here well, don't you?
Yes, you can really see how extraordinary it is. And from here in Norman times, it was as I was saying, it had a pyramid roof, and then John decided he wanted to use that extra bit of curtain wall and recreate a room up there, or create a room up there. So he just raised the height of the roof and made a flatter roof.
Yes. So there's another layer.
So there's another level. Well, we'll go up. I'll go up there too. Have you? I'm sure you've seen it a million times, but the film A Knight's Tale.
I have seen it. Yes, I have seen it.
And there's a hilarious bit of dancing in it. and they are in the ballroom dancing to David Bowie, and it's really funny. And those chandeliers. We got them from a prop company, and they were in the film.
Brilliant.
Isn't that hilarious?
Yes, I love that.
So next time you watch it, it's a very funny film actually. Next time you watch it, just look up
and see them.
And yes, you only sort of glimpse them, as one never does, but it's very funny.
You're obviously very good at sourcing things with your background.
Well, we're pretty good at rummaging, I have to say. Yes, it's all good. But isn't it wonderful walking around here?
Yes. It connects all the sides, so you can walk right the way around the hall.
And the bit that I've left to last on this is actually one of my favourite bits of the keep here, which is this sculpture here.
Yes, isn't that beautiful?
Isn't that amazing? And actually the way you knew your way around a Norman building was that you always went, so as you can see, there's one door to the Minstrel's Gallery a little bit further down the stairs, and then this is the other one, and you always went to the one with the sculpture, and the other one was unadorned, and thus you knew your way, the right way round the building. And sometimes the sculpture on the left-hand side of a door is greater than the sculpture on the right-hand side of the door, which means that when you go through the door, you know you have to go round to your left.
Is that right? I've never heard of that before. That's absolutely fantastic.
Isn't it a wonderful fact?
Yeah. So you basically you're adorning the outside bit, so you know that you're being invited in.
Yes.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And we'll carry on further up to the floor of the keep. So this again, so you should have gone through that door. There isn't any sculpture there, but it's a grander door than this, and it has the platform and things. But just because of how we've planned this out now, we use this door. And this is our museum, which we're going to completely redo. Find, obviously, portraying history to different age groups very difficult. And you put something on a board, and to you it would be utterly banal, but to a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old, totally fascinating, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so
totally.
I've decided to do it differently, and we're going to have magazines with all the images in it, and one will be called Hail instead of Hello, and be full of gossip and fashion.
Yeah.
And then the other one be called Castle Life instead of Country Life, and that would be all about the architecture.
Yeah.
And do it in that way. And each type of magazine will have 3 different editions. So one is for 6-year-olds, and one is for intellectuals, and one is for someone in the middle, possibly. You know, so that it's different different things.
So this space would have been used. Was this the most private of?
Yes.
So this would be the bed chamber, the privy chamber, essentially. For the
come and look at our recreation of the Tudor bed, which is quite
isn't
good
it
fun.
Gorgeous? Oh, it's so lovely.
So we now have this for anyone who wants to come and stay, and all the brides and grooms always want to come and stay here after their wedding, because actually there is nowhere else practically in the whole world where you can stay in a Norman keep all on your own,
and that's very special,
which is rather amazing.
Yes, I bet as the sun sets and it all goes. it's quiet now. We're in the middle of the morning, I bet it's so romantic.
It's really romantic, and obviously you can't have. We have to present this room very much for people to look round, so it has to be completely accurate. So we can't have curtains on the windows. I mean, obviously there weren't windows then, but you can't have curtains on the windows to keep the light away from bed. So the curtains close on the 4-poster bed, and in that little alcove is where the loo is, and then here. This looks like a Cassoni chest, and that's where the bath is.
Oh, how amazing!
And obviously, while you're sitting in your bath, having got married, you can then have your champagne. So this opens to be a shelf, so that you can put your champagne on the shelf. And I'm just going to see if this is open.
That's so clever.
You may want to light a fire, but we allow candles mostly, but not up here, just in case one fell asleep.
Yes.
So we then have the iron fire back that then opens. And you can, and it is revealed a television. So you can then light a fire courtesy of Netflix or YouTube, hilariously. And so you can sit in your bath or in bed with the fire lit and dim the lights and enjoy.
I'm speechless, and that's very rare. That is amazing. Oh my goodness, that is amazing. How ingenious. I love your creativity. It's just brilliant. Brilliant.
Well, you know, it had to be everything's got to be fun in life, hasn't it?
I would have never have known, and so there you go.
What I also adore is there's a little light switch in the bed, and you can turn it. I'll show you.
Oh, please.
You can actually turn off the candles when you go to bed just by flicking the switch. Have a look. You flick the switch, and then they go out.
And all modern conveniences.
Which is so funny, isn't it? Because you can't do that with most candles.
No, you really can't.
So it's very
lovely.
funny.
I love it.
So it is quite funny. And then the Thunderbird noise when you, which is just priceless, isn't it? It is amusing. It is amusing.
I don't think I've ever seen the like, and I love it. I want one. Yeah, this is
have a look in the loo. It's quite funny. Oh yeah, well
Oh yes,
it's quite a small room.
Look at this. It's so cute. I could live in this loo. Oh, love it. So when did you do this?
So we started this in lockdown, and then we finished it only about a year and a half ago, because actually it took a long time, getting all the pipework up here for the radiators and the, all of that sort of thing, and getting it right, and doing the bed, and this is all Gainsborough Silk, which is up the road. So she's amazing, Diane at Gainsborough Silk. So you go to the sale rail, and I was choosing, you can't have it all in one colour, because no Tudor bed was just all one colour, really. It was sort of slightly mix and match. So you're having little bits in it, and these bits, and yes, it just took its time. But
I would call this the mother of all lockdown projects. I think you have won the prize. Just everybody else can stand back. The hunt is over. Absolutely amazing. I'm going to have a look at your views as well, because
the views are incredible from up here, and you can really see why they built this as a defensive structure here.
You can just see.
Because you look down across the Colne Valley, and you're on a sort of spur of land. Yeah. So it's a really good location.
How beautiful. Well, I feel very happy.
And this is also Southend Pier. This is
Southend Pier as well.
The other way.
Well, congratulations. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Have you put this up for an award? Because you should do.
I don't know what award. The most bonkers bedroom award.
So obviously, brides and grooms, etc., can say, can you stay here? Can you?
Yes,
you can book to stay.
Yes,
you can book to stay. I said nudge, nudge, wink, wink, looking at Chris, for dear listeners who are thinking,
funny.
What is she after? Anyway, that's great, funny. Because I do ask that, because I do have a historic accommodations page as well.
Oh,
so
you?
I will add you.
This is quite historic.
It certainly is. I will definitely be adding you to the page.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you. Well, we'd like that very much. I mean,
So we're up on the upper floor, as we were saying. This was used to be the Privy Chamber, and perhaps the 13th Earl and his Countess would have lived here while they were building the Prospect Tower.
Absolutely.
But we perhaps should just return to conclude his story, because we left him having fought at Bosworth, and then lands and wealth and titles were bestowed upon him. And actually his military service wasn't quite done, obviously, because he went to defend again on behalf of Henry VII at the Battle of Stoke Field, which, again, I have another podcast to, dear listeners, if you wanted to learn all about that. And he emerged victorious.
Absolutely.
What happened to him then? Was his life fairly straightforward after that?
I think it sort of was, wasn't it? I mean, he must have been relatively an old man at that point.
I think so, and I think he died in 1513.
He did, yes. And he's buried at Colne Priory, which the administrational centre of the Earls of Oxford is a place called Earl's Colne, which is now a village. But it's a good sort of, it would have taken quite a long time to ride there, the morning probably, it's 10 miles away or whatever. And there was a huge priory church, and all the Earls of Oxford were buried there. It doesn't exist anymore. It was pulled down by Henry VIII. But all the tombs were then moved to the along. There was somewhere in the middle, but they're now all in St Stephen's Chapel in Bures, which is a town just south or village just south of Sudbury in Suffolk.
And it may be that I have the opportunity to nip over there after we finish today.
So I recommend it. It's the most beautiful chapel, and it was where St Edmund of Bury St Edmunds was crowned.
Oh, was it indeed?
Yeah.
How very interesting.
Yes.
So we have John. I think he was 71 when he died here. I think it was the 13th of March, 1513.
His funeral was an enormous affair, wasn't it? And on his coffin there was his helm, and they took his fighting helm and put on it the boar, which is his crest. His crest.
And I think there is an account of that funeral, and there's a book that I've come across that specifically looks at the life and times of the 13th Earl, and I'll put, again, dear listeners, I'll put a link in the podcast if you're interested in diving deeper into that. But we do have an account of his funeral, and I think he lay in state here in the chapel, and then was taken to the local parish church, which is literally a stone's throw from the castle, and where I'll be going to next, because... And that was before, of course, he was moved to Colne Priory, as you were saying, and finally interred in the family mausoleum there. But what we do have in the local parish church is the tomb, the monument to the 15th.
We do. Yes, which is rather an amazing tomb.
It's beautiful.
Yes, it's lovely.
I nipped and saw it yesterday, but I'd love to go back, and perhaps we'll record a little bit of a section there. But the 15th Earl wasn't a direct descendant of the 13th Earl. He didn't have any children, did he, I think, John de Vere?
No.
Not legitimate, anyway, that we're able to... that we're admitting to.
Yes, no, that we're admitting to. No. So yes, the 15th Earl was, well, I mean, semi-related, weren't they? But yes.
I think he was his nephew.
I think he was his nephew.
I think he was his nephew. So...
yes, because the 14th Earl was a brother.
And died quite young, I think aged 26.
Yes, quite quickly.
I think Henry VIII told him off for being a bit sort of gluttonous, I was reading, and said he needed to rein in his ways. Anyway, maybe that's why he died only as 26. But yes, the next Earl, the 15th Earl.
The next Earl was... went with Henry VIII to the field of the cloth of gold.
He did.
Which actually... apparently in French it was really just the buttercup field down the road, wasn't it? Well, and they rather glamorised it.
They definitely glamorised it. But even if you go today, as I have done, it is just a field in the middle of nowhere. It is not very salubrious at all. But
what I like about the 15th Earl was that when he came back, and I can't quite remember why he didn't really favour Hedingham as his seat. Maybe because the Countess, the Dowager Countess, was still here or whatever, and he wanted to... Oh, I know, it was because he was at Cambridge, wasn't it, possibly, University, and he wanted to be closer. Anyway, one of their lands further north from here is a place called Castle Camps, and anyway, he decided to build a better, or, his base there. He's still having this as his seat. And apparently the architecture, it's now nothing. You can't really see other than a little mound. It's got a manor house on it. But he created a sort of stage set kind of castle for himself, or a house, that was really like all those amazing tents and things in the field of the cloth of gold, which is rather a wonderful, architectural conceit, isn't it? In the theme of.
He obviously enjoyed himself, and he has an interesting history. But I will pick that up when we go and visit his tomb shortly. If you're interested in Tudor history, the 15th Earl was right at the centre of some really important events associated with the reign of Henry VIII. But we'll come back to that in a moment or two. Well, I think our tour is probably concluded, but I should ask you, again, perhaps you could tell us how people can find out more about visiting or even staying in this royal chamber, which I highly recommend, ladies and gentlemen. How did they find out more about you? And can you tell us about your visiting hours in general?
Yes, so we have a website, which is hedinghamcastle.co.uk, but it and that tells you all our events. So it depends what kind of a person you are. You can see Hedingham in so many different ways. If you want just a peaceful trip and just looking around, then we're open on just open days. It's all on the calendar there. But some of the things that really enliven the history are the jousts and the historical events, which I think are just tremendous, because the people who come and do the jousting or the reenactments are so passionate about what they do, and they're so fascinating. So you find out a huge amount more at that point as well, because you can ask all those people and they tell you about living in Tudor times or Norman times or whatever it is, and depending on what their strand of history is.
And you can enjoy the thrill of the joust.
Other people want to, yes, the thrill of the joust, which is so exciting. And other people just want to get their teenagers anywhere near a castle, so they come to the open air cinema or whatever. But it's really interesting because that sort of thing just rubs off on people just by osmosis. And we all know how difficult it is getting teenagers out of bed, but our latest thing is De Vere gin, which was devised as because it's quite nice to taste, but it also is a good way of introducing heritage to the 20-somethings, because they're not traditionally really excited by stones and things and history. So
more's the pity.
Yeah, I know, but you get to them through a nice cocktail evening.
Yes.
Suddenly they think, okay, it's not so bad.
Well, there you go. So as ever, all links are in the description. Wonderful. Well, as I say, I'm going to go on a little journey down the road to the parish church in a moment to have a look at the tomb of the 15th Earl. But I just wanted to say thank you, Demetra, for showing us around this amazing castle. It's been so much fun.
It's been such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
You have been listening to the first part of this month's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. The remainder of this episode is only available to members of my membership site, The Ultimate Guide to Exploring Tudor England. To join the waitlist to become a member of The Ultimate Guide, click on the link in the description associated with this podcast. You will be added to the waiting list, and I will email you just as soon as the doors to the membership next reopen. I'll see you there. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please